On Space Day this year, the one thing that was most difficult for me to attain was an astronaut, particularly with what happened with Columbia. Without them, the other two guys aren't coming back. And they get that job because they are the phenomenal pilots, astronauts that they are. I want to introduce to you, and I would love a wonderful applause for Dick Gordon, Apollo 12, Gemini 11 astronaut.
I'm too tired. I'm going to sit down. Hi, everybody. Hi. It's a mixed crowd like this, so I'll probably talk mostly to the children. I hope you parents can understand it. You know, when I talk about the early days of the space program, my kids say, Dad, are you going to give another history lesson? And I say, no, I don't think so. They say, well, if you do, we're going to call it ancient history. And when you think about it, it almost is. Paul just mentioned it's been 31 years almost since we've been to the moon, and I think it's a real shame that we haven't been back. But I do want to give you a little history, a little feel for what was going on in the early days of the space program and how we got to where we are today. How many of you remember the decade of the 60s? I don't mean we're born, but really remember it. See how many of you holding your hands? Not very many, right? That's kind of interesting, but I relate to those days by referring to a little novel that was written by Charles Dickens, an English author, and was published in 1859. Now, 100 years later, in 1959, I think the same line that started that novel could be applied very directly. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And think about the decade of the 60s. You young people will probably be reading about this in your history lessons as you get a little bit older. But the decade of the 60s for America was a very, very rough time. Let me talk a little bit about it. Had the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, Cuban Missile Crisis, the very divisive war in Vietnam that tore this nation apart, Kent State, where some students were killed, the assassination of a president in 1963, the assassination of John Brother Bobby, along with Martin Luther King in 1968. There were probably a few other things that we function, and they essentially orbited in space without much to keep them occupied for 8 days. A beginning test of a little bit of endurance. After that, Gemini 6 was scheduled. It had a hole kill on the pad. By that I mean the engines ignited for a very short period of time. They should have lifted off right then, but the engine shut down. It's what we call a hole kill, and it was a very tense moment because we weren't sure that the Titan II was stable on the pad, and we had to reduce the pressure in the tank before we could get the crew up. So what happened next? Then we took Gemini 6 off the pad, put Gemini 7 on, and it became the endurance contest of the Gemini program. Frank Borman and Jim Lovell flew in a garbage can for 14 days. And this is precisely what it ended up being after 14 days. It was a garbage can. And to me, that in the entire Gemini program, I think that was probably the toughest flight that was probably conducted. They couldn't do anything in that vehicle. You were sitting like this, and you were there. You could move your hands and everything. You couldn't move your legs. You couldn't move, and you had to sit there in that position. Even though it was in 0G, you had to be there for 14 days. Getting to know each other more than you care to remember. Anyway, that ended the long duration flights. So while they were flying, we put Gemini 6 back in the pad, and Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford conducted the first rendezvous in space using Gemini 7 as their target. So now we're really starting to percolate in the Gemini program. Gemini 8 means orbit, rendezvous in the third orbit, or the fourth orbit, or the fifth, or whatever. The life of the ascent stage of the lunar module was approximately 9 hours. And it takes 2 hours for each orbit around the moon as opposed to the 90 minutes around the Earth. Well, that lifespan being about 9 hours, we didn't have much of a cushion if we wasted 4 hours to rendezvous with it. So the flight that I flew on with Pete Conrad on Gemini 11, we charged with outside the bag and hook it onto the Gemini vehicle, and every time I let go to do that, I'd start floating away. Well, this became very, very frustrating and very, very hard work. So I finally got the tether on, but I'll let you relate to that kind of activity. Those of you that have shoelaces in your shoes, untie them and tie them back up with one hand. That's the kind of frustration that I was faced with. We finally learned, after all this time of the EVA experience we had, you're not out there just to float around. You're supposed to be out there to do useful work. Well, our training methods were wrong. We had to provide tethers, window washers, belt, foot restraints. We had to provide a method of keeping ourselves at a workstation, in place, not floating away from it, and to be able to utilize both hands to do useful work. In addition to that, we started to use water tanks, big, huge water tanks to simulate the zero-G. Now, the viscosity obviously is different. If you didn't try to swim against it, you could simulate long timelines of zero gravity. So we modified our activities and learned how to simulate the things that that would happen to us in space. Well, finally on Gemini 12, the last flight of the Gemini program, and go away. No, keep flying. The Gemini program ended in November of 1966 with the successful EVA period performed by Buzz Aldrin. Well, we were ready to start the Apollo program. Let's go to the moon. First Apollo flight, first manned Apollo flight was called Apollo 1. And they were doing routine ground tests at the Cape. And on January the 27th of 1967, a fire broke out in the spacecraft, and we lost the lives of 3 good friends. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffin. What happened? Well, we had become very complacent, and humans do this, believe me, with our successes in Mercury and Gemini. Here we were operating in 100% oxygen environment. We had flammable material, clothing we wore, the Velcro, the checklist, the paper that we utilized. And all we needed for a disaster was a source of ignition. Well, unfortunately, it was provided by a short circuit underneath Gus's couch. Excuse me. I asked for vodka and I got water. What's going on here? Well, a short circuit was provided. We had a real problem on our hands. We had a deadline going to the moon before the decade was over for President Kennedy and the American people. And we had some real problems. The spacecraft that we were to fly was called Block 1. It was the early design of the spacecraft. And we were getting ready to fly Block 2 spacecraft, which were better designed, and I'll enumerate the things that we did. We had to eliminate 100% oxygen environment. On the pad of ground testing, we used essentially air. 80% nitrogen, 20% oxygen, as we are breathing here at this moment. We had to eliminate as much of the flammable material that we could. Instead of wallpapering the spacecraft with Velcro, for our convenience, we could stick things all over it. It wasn't necessary in zero-G. You got a little tiny 1-inch square. and you could put things on that. So we started using little dots around the spacecraft, and it worked perfectly satisfactorily. No problem using it that way. We didn't need the convenience of wallpaper. We got rid of the netting that we were using to hold certain things. We redesigned the electrical system, better protection with wire trays. We had potting behind the instrument panel. We did as much as we possibly could to protect the electrical system in the spacecraft from being damaged and causing a short circuit. In addition to this, we redesigned the hatch. So in the Block 2 vehicle, we were able to open a hatch in a very few seconds. On the Block 1 vehicles, it was like, I guess you'd say it was like a window on a ship where it's dogged down, a porthole, if you will, where you've got devices that you lock it down, like a pressure cooker, I guess is one way to say it, that you lock it down all the way around. And the problem was it opened inward. So you had to undog it and pull it inboard against the pressure that was there in the spacecraft itself. Well, this was virtually humanly impossible. So the consequences of all this in the Block 1 spacecraft, three friends lost their lives through suffocation, not the fire per se. The spacesuits protected them very well. But we had to correct all that. It took us from January of 1967 to October of 1968 to fly the first Apollo flight. And it was called Apollo 7. Now, everybody wondered what happened. The first one on the fire was called Apollo 1. What happened to all those flights in between? Well, NASA just loves to confuse the American people. So they skipped all those, but they really didn't. They went back and renumbered all of the unmanned Saturn flights in the program. And by so doing, they filled in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 with unmanned Saturn vehicles. So Apollo 7 became the first flight of the Command and Service Module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 was the next flight, scheduled for December of 1968. But think about this for just a minute. Think about the leadership and the decision makers we had in those days. They decided to take Apollo 8, since it did not have a lunar module and could not test fly it. They didn't want to in Earth orbit. And they didn't want to repeat what Apollo 7 had just accomplished. You don't learn anything when you repeat things like that. Teachers may disagree with that, but nonetheless it's true. So the decision was made to send Apollo 8 to the moon, circumnavigate the moon for about 20 hours and return. Well, think if that had been Apollo 13. How many saw the movie Apollo 13? I'm sure quite a few of you did. They used the lunar module as a lifeboat to get back home on Apollo 13. They didn't have one for Apollo 8. So most of us think that our leaders, management, the decision-making process that existed at NASA at that time was an extremely bold event. And it ended 1968, a very bad year for most Americans, on a very high note by the Apollo 8 crew, if you will, reading first book of Genesis and returning to Earth around Christmas time in 1968. Well, let's get going with the lunar module. The next flight, Apollo 9, which Pete and I and Alan Bean were the backup crew. The crew was Jim McDivitt and Rusty Schweikert and Dave Scott. A 10-day flight around the Earth with the lunar module, the first flight of a lunar module. It worked out, was very satisfactory, no problems. They did a super job with it. They undocked, they operated the lunar module independently. They staged it. By that I mean the descent stage was operated. They separated so they could operate just the ascent stage. It was a two-stage vehicle. And rendezvoused and docked with the command module and came back home after an extremely successful flight. Apollo 10 was next, and it became known as the dress rehearsal for the next flight, which was Apollo 11, which is now scheduled to be the first landing flight to the moon. Apollo 10 flew the moon with the lunar module, operated as if they were going to land in lunar orbit, were limited and could not land because of weight and design consideration, so had to stop their performance at 50,000 feet above the surface of the moon. Well, that's only 10 miles above the surface when they started at 60 miles where the command module was. 10 did everything except the landing, the last 50,000 feet, and we always used to kid Neil, "Hey Neil, all you've got to do is fly 50,000 feet, everything else has been done." Neil would kind of scratch his head and look at you with that Wapakoneta, Ohio look and say, "Yeah, but the last 50,000 feet is not trivial." And he was so right. Finally, on the 20th of July of 1969, we had accomplished what our late president sent us out to do. We had landed on the moon, returned men safely to Earth. Well, next flight up was Apollo 12, which I had the extreme privilege of flying and being a command module pilot, flying with my friends Pete Conrad and Alan B. We were the second lunar landing flight. We flew in November of 1969, and we had a specific task to perform. We learned and found out that Apollo 11 did not land where they intended to. Yeah, they did land on the moon in spite of what you may think about it. We did do it. But the problem was he landed about 4 miles or 4 kilometers beyond his intended landing site. Well, this was intolerable. We couldn't do this in the rest of the program. You may not realize this, but the moon has 13,000-foot mountains. It has valleys, which we call rills, deep cracks in the lava, however they were formed. I don't care how they were, but we can argue about that later. But these are deep valleys. They're cut, grooved in the lunar surface. We had to land alongside those, alongside the mountains, and alongside the materials in it, fibers, glass, metal, whatever, and contained most of the metals that had been exposed to the solar environment existing on the moon for all that period of time. Well, in addition to that, Pete cut off a scoop and brought some other things back. But we proved that we could land precisely where we wanted to. Pete and Al landed on the very rim of that 600-meter crater within walking distance of the survey. That's not bad Kentucky windage for flying 240,000 miles. And the techniques was navigational techniques. It wasn't anything that we did in particular. We had learned that we hadn't understood the mass concentrations of large masses beneath the lunar surface, probably because of the numerous meteorite strikes that it was exposed to. And then we had some perturbations to the orbit caused by the lunar module itself. So navigational techniques were upgraded using Doppler effects to precisely position ourselves around the moon. Well, the rest of the Apollo program proceeded very rapidly with the exception of the flight of Apollo 13. Even though at first NASA considered Apollo 13 a failed flight, when you think about it, it may have been NASA's best hour. They saved the lives of 3 young men and did it superbly well. This was totally unexpected. Obviously, it was not trained for. The fact that the lunar module could be used as a lifeboat in the program was considered. But the devastating effect of an oxygen tank having blown up was never even in nobody's thoughts at all. So that was never even considered as a training device. So we survived that one. 3 guys survived. Now it's become a very popular thing with the Apollo space program. Everybody that saw the movie excited everyone, because for the first time, even though it was a movie, Tom Hanks and crew did a very, very good job with it, and you got to see what went on inside the spacecraft for just about the very first time. Okay, Apollo 14 took up 13's flight, landed in Frau Maro, Highland Plateaus. 15 was a flight that I was a backup commander on, it landed alongside this mountain, just in front of that wheel. The mountain was Mount Hadley, 13,000. It was a very, very rapid flight. It did that in a matter of 6.5 minutes or so. So the load factors in the Titan went from the first stage, which was very moderate, to the second stage, which was the highest velocity, highest acceleration at the orbital altitude. And it got you there with about 7 Gs at the time it shut down. I mean, it was a real hot rod. And my first experience with it, when you got to 7 Gs, it started to hurt. You know what I'm saying? Isn't this thing ever going to quit? And it shut down. And it did. And all of a sudden you go bang from 7 Gs to 0 G. And you're, like this. And the transition is extremely rapid. As soon as that thing shuts down, it's just like that. The Saturn V was not designed as an intercontinental ballistic missile. It had 3 stages. The acceleration in the first stage didn't get you in orbit until well after 10 minutes. 10 minutes and 30 seconds, I don't remember the exact number, 10:35, something like that. But the first stage was limited because of structure. Here's this thing 363 feet tall, and the engines are moving at the bottom, and it's guiding this limber vehicle out there, and you're sitting on the end of a springboard, feeling all this stuff. But the structure was limited to 4.5 Gs.
You want to ask a question, Willis?
So when you got to 4.5 Gs of the first stage, the center engine
Want to ask my question?
shut down. It was not gimbal, so
What do you think it should have?
the other 4 would be the guidance. There's a freight train going straight up. I knew what freight trains do all this kind of shake, rattle, and roll. A young lady in a pink shirt.
Must have been a blow.
Did I hear her properly? What's it like being up in space? Occupational disease is going deaf. I call it, at home, I call it selective hearing. I hear what I want to hear. Husbands, you agree with that? That's a tough question. It's, I can't describe it to allow you to relate to anything. It's like floating when you've never floated. It's zero gravity. You don't have any pressure. I'd have to strap myself in just to sit here on the stage if it was in 0 G. But you adapt to it fairly rapidly. Most people do. And the sensation of floating in 0 G is a sensation that it's really like. And if you could just suspend yourself underwater and just kind of float around in there, it's kind of like what it is. Anything except the sensation of floating. And it's when you have food fights, there's a lot of fun up there. You take a spoonful of water and you can flip it at your partner and see if you can system knock the fuel cells off the line. They stop providing electrical power to the vehicle. Fortunately, during launch, you have the batteries online, so you don't totally lose electrical power. But we looked up there, and there's a whole continuum, 12 or so lights associated with the electrical system that all just came on the aircraft, as well as on the aircraft carrier, that helps you make these precision landings. The landing area on an aircraft carrier is 3 wires, and it's only about 200 or 300 feet long. So it's a very, very precise maneuver. But the nice thing about it, you're under control when you start. You're actually flying the airplane. So you have airspeed and you have altitude. The catapult shot is a totally different story. You're out there in 120 feet, in about 2 seconds you're going from 0 to 150 knots. And you're scrambling for altitude and airspeed. You only got about 90 feet of altitude above the water. So you want to start accelerating and climbing at the same time. Get away from that hard water. People think water is soft, it's not. Paul, here you go.
Okay, after this, after the auction, Dick Gordon is going to go down to the table and do autographs. While he's going to get inundated, I would like, if you'd like to stay for 15 minutes, Mr. Curt Newport, who's to Dick's left, is one of the world's leading oceanographers. Who have heard of the Titanic? He's, I think, have you been to the Titanic or close to it? He dove on the Titanic. He is responsible for bringing up the Liberty Bell 7, Gus Grissom's spacecraft that was lost. Now, let me say, it was 1,000 feet further down than the Titanic. It's the size of a phone booth. There's 51 pieces of metal on the ground, and this gentleman found it the first shot. So, I would like him to speak.
I wanted to also make some comments about a very good friend who has a very charming wife. Vicki, where are you? Hi, honey. Andy Chaikin and I met 69, 12 years old, but he came to visit Pete Conrad and I, who flew on the Apollo program, A Man on the Moon. It became the basis for Tom Hanks' HBO series From the Earth to the Moon. And Apollo 12 made Andy a very famous person.
Okay. We're going to do the auction for the hot air balloon ride in Connecticut. Again, it's worth $250. So those who are interested, please hang around only because Mr. Curt Newport is going to speak in a second. But I was wondering if we could start the bidding for a hot air balloon ride at say $125. Do we have takers for a hot air balloon ride for $125? Okay, I'll make it. Let's start at 75. 75 for a hot air balloon ride. Do I hear 90?
100.
We have 100. We have 100. Anybody take it for 100? A hot air balloon ride worth $250. Oh, we have, what did I say? 125? 125. Okay, do we have 150? I don't believe so. I believe it's for a pair of individuals. Well, it wouldn't be individual if it's a pair. Okay? Okay, so. Oh, I'm sorry. It's for the winner. One person. 125 for one person. Hot air balloon ride. 125. 125 going once. 125 going twice.
You got it. There you go.
Sold. 125. Thank you so much. Now, if you. Thank you very, very much. I'd like to introduce you as soon as the.
I have to tell you a story. It was after a tour with our telescopes, and I was exhausted, and I was trying to take a nap. In the same room, there were 5 little kids, trying to count from 1 to 10. And 1, 2, 4, like this, tried several times. I couldn't make 1 to 10. So I couldn't sleep, so I counted backwards. 10, 9, 8, 7, like that. 1. Blast off, they all said in unison. That tells you what decade you're in. You can't count from 1 to 10, but they know what happened when you count backwards.
Right. Yeah.
Now they have to aim that thing for this field.
Yeah, they gotta get over there, huh? See, they had to take the
I
wind
don't know how they
consideration.
aim for this like that, but they have to have some control on it.
Yeah, otherwise it could end up anywhere.
And I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when they had that balloon festival, you know, hundreds of hot air balloons. They have to avoid landing on the highway. They can land in the ditch, they can't land in the highway.
Hanging underneath.
Look, there's one over there. Whoa!
Yeah.
I got 2 of them.
There they go, Willis.
That is too easy. Come on.
Let's have a great big round of applause for the Air Adventures Parachute Team.
What do you think, Willis? You want to try that sometime?
Couldn't they do something challenging?
Helicopter again.
When I do it,
Anybody can do it.
On here, man.
Eat him. 12 o'clock.
Hi.
Hey, buddy. Just run over there and you grab a bag, right?
They are in the Air Force.
Air Force. That's
Air
a,
Force.
yeah.
Oh, check it out. We have them. Is that?
Some of these guys will be retired before 10.
Oh, what's over there on that picture?
Thunderbird.
Fuel heater. Fuel control.
I'm not sure about that. I don't think we can just it's on the carrier.
Okay, now. Okay, what we've done, the present spacesuit. If you notice, if you were to go to nitrogen gas, if you're going to a two-gas system just like Earth, you would have basically a real problem. So what we've done is we've taken the display and control module, we've taken the backpack, we put it all outside in space vacuum. So now there's no potential for a spark. Yeah. We only wear these spacesuits outside, the Mach 25 spacesuits. We've only made a total of 18 spacesuits. We lost 2 on the Challenger and 2 on the Columbia. We've only got about 14 spacesuits left. 300 pounds, and it takes us 3 years to make one. Okay? You want some information on it? There's the parts. So there's all the materials. Basically what you do is, this is the basic soft goods. You have the inner layer of neoprene, nylon neoprene. Inside is 100% breathing oxygen. We don't have a mixture of nitrogen. Your body can live at the partial pressure of oxygen beautifully. However, you can't just put your spacesuit on inside the shuttle and go out and catch a satellite because you could possibly get the bends. So you got to go through a pre-breathing process. There is a system on board where you lower the nitrogen, you lower the pressure inside the cabin here for the 24 hours ahead of time. And all 7 astronauts go through a partial pre-breathing. When they want to go outside, 2 of the astronauts go in the airlock and they continue for another hour. That's about how long it takes to put the spacesuit on anyway. They go out and do their spacewalk and they do their thing. They come back in.
Nitrogen content in the pre-built of the astronaut's body before you go for a spacewalk.
Well, that's the pre-breathing process. When you're out in space, inside the suit, you only have 100% pure oxygen. To make the suit safe now, all the electronics is outside. Inside is only oxygen, so there's no potential hot spots or hot bearings inside the spacesuit.
Now inside the space shuttle, what do you do?
Inside, starting with the shuttle, the Mir, the space station, all the future spacecraft are basically going to be a 2-gas system, 14.7 psia, a mixture of nitrogen and oxygen, the same as on the ground. Except for gravity, we have the same basic temperature, a little bit higher CO2 partial pressure, but not enough to affect the person. Okay, that's one of the problems with the space station though. We have about 0.1% of partial pressure of CO2 levels. That is more than Earth. So if you want to compare your data on space station with scientific data on Earth, you got one disclaimer, and that's a little bit difference in CO2 partial pressure.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
How much of this is Hamilton responsible?
We are 100% the prime contract for the spacesuits. Now, David Clark makes the flight suits. Okay. Basically, okay. Then you put your spacesuit on. The spacesuit weighs roughly 300 pounds. Now they do training. The spacesuit itself becomes a beautiful diving suit. And all the training mostly is done down in Houston inside of a diving tank. What they do is take the backpack and modify it slightly. Okay, would you like to be in a spacesuit? Now. Thank you. How would you play checkers in space? I don't know. What's that? Velcro, okay. So you got, now take your little check, put it there. Okay, now ping me or eat your safe. That piece of machinery could be just about as unsafe, but I learned a lot of things in the farm. Kids nowadays are the computer generation. Everything you do is a computer. The computer's not going to build a robot. So you got to learn that we help kids build those things. And so all I'm trying to say is, yes, we have gone to the point of being very, very
What happens is we got a TV, and we just need a place to plug in.
Oh, are you the guys with the CDs?
We're the gloves. No, not the CDs. We'll get the gloves. So the TV will be. We'll try and get everything, steal a chair back.
Yeah, I just have some kids trying to space.
No, that's fine. Look at this boy.
Yeah, you want to try that one on. Oh, okay.
And you have to, whoever wins this, you must notify within 10 days of using the gift certificate. Okay, so we're going to introduce, somebody's going to